My coworker has been stealing my lunch every day for 6 months, and HR won't do anything because she's the CEO's niece. The moment I knew my life was about to implode wasn't when I found the emails. It wasn't when the detective showed me the surveillance footage. It was when my doctor looked up from my blood work with an expression I'd never seen on another human being's face before, something between horror and disbelief, and said 3 words that made my stomach drop through the floor. You've been poisoned. I'd been working at Meridian Technologies for 4 years when Caitlin Ostrander joined our team. She came in with the kind of confidence that only nepotism can buy: bright smile, expensive clothes, and a complete disregard for the unwritten rules that keep office life tolerable. Her aunt was CEO Diane Ostrander, a fact Caitlin made sure everyone knew within her first week. She was 26, fresh out of a graduate program her aunt's money had purchased for her, and assigned to my project team despite having 0 relevant experience. I was 32, senior developer, and had spent 4 years building the reputation she was now coasting on by association. The lunch thing started small. Week 1, I noticed my yogurt was missing from the communal fridge. Week 2, my sandwich disappeared. I labeled my containers with my name in permanent marker. Didn't matter. By week 3, I was losing lunch 3 times a week. I started recognizing the pattern, always on days when Caitlin came in late, always when she'd complained about skipping breakfast. Other people noticed too. Dev, the QA engineer who sat next to me, saw her eating my leftover pasta one afternoon. She didn't even try to hide it, just smiled at him and said something about how she'd forgotten her lunch and figured no one would mind sharing. When Dev told me, I felt that familiar nod of frustration, the kind you get when you know confronting something will cause more problems than it solves. I went to HR in month 2, filed a formal complaint with Rita Beaumont, the HR manager who'd been with the company for 8 years. She listened with the practiced expression of someone who'd heard it all before, took notes on her tablet, nodded sympathetically. Then she asked if I'd tried talking to Caitlin directly. I explained that I had 3 times. Each time, Caitlin had laughed it off, said she must have grabbed the wrong container by accident, promised it wouldn't happen again. But it kept happening. Rita said she'd look into it and have a conversation with Caitlin. 2 weeks later, nothing had changed, except now Caitlin smirked at me whenever we passed in the hallway. The theft continued. My labeled containers kept vanishing. I started bringing lunch in an insulated bag that I kept at my desk instead of the fridge. She found it anyway. Month 3, I escalated. Sent a detailed email to Rita with dates, times, estimated cost of stolen food, over $400 at that point. Attached photos of my labeled containers. CC'd my manager, Neil Thornton, thinking surely someone with authority would care about blatant, repeated theft. Neil called me into his office the next day. He was uncomfortable, kept adjusting his tie, wouldn't quite meet my eyes. He said Rita had spoken to Caitlin, who denied everything. He suggested maybe I was overreacting about a minor workplace issue. When I pointed out that stealing someone's food daily for 3 months wasn't minor, he got defensive. Said I needed to consider the bigger picture, and that making waves over lunch wasn't career smart. Then he mentioned, almost casually, that Caitlin's aunt had personally approved his last bonus. The message was clear. I wish I could say I was surprised, but corporate politics had taught me that fairness was a myth. What surprised me was how brazenly she escalated. Month 4, she started taking my breakfast. I'd bring overnight oats in a mason jar. She'd take those too. Protein bars from my desk drawer, gone. The coffee I'd buy from the cafe downstairs and leave on my desk while I used the bathroom, she'd drink half of it. It was like she was testing how far she could push, knowing I had no recourse. Other co-workers started noticing. Some expressed sympathy. None offered to help. No one wanted to cross the CEO's niece. Dev told me quietly that he'd seen her going through my desk drawers when I was in meetings. That's when the fear started. Not just frustration, but actual fear. What else was she looking for? Month 5, I started experiencing symptoms. Headaches that wouldn't quit, even with medication. Nausea that came in waves, usually in the afternoons. Brain fog that made coding nearly impossible some days. I thought it was stress at first. The constant low-level anxiety of working in a hostile environment, knowing someone was violating your space daily and no one cared. I started working from home when possible, which helped temporarily, but my manager pushed back. Said team cohesion required in-office presence. Said I needed to be more collaborative. Meanwhile, Caitlin was working from home 2 or 3 days a week without comment. When I pointed out this discrepancy, Neil just said her situation was different. Of course it was. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in month 6. I'd brought my lunch in a locked container, one of those with a combination lock, which I realize now sounds insane, but I was desperate. I'd hidden it in my gym bag under my desk, came back from a client call to find the bag unzipped, the container opened, EUR lock somehow defeated EUR, and my food gone. But this time, Caitlin had made a mistake. She'd left evidence. A credit card receipt from the locksmith store downtown, dated 2 days earlier, for a combination lock decoder. It had fallen out of her purse, which was sitting open on her desk. She was at lunch, probably eating my food somewhere. I photographed the receipt with trembling hands. Finally, proof. Proof of premeditation, proof of the lengths she was going to. I sent it to Rita immediately, CC'd Neil, and this time also his manager, operations director, Jeffrey Lansing. Jeffrey called me into a conference room within an hour. I thought finally, someone was taking this seriously. Instead, he closed the door and told me I needed to let this go. Said I was developing a reputation as difficult, and that my obsession with this lunch situation was concerning to leadership. When I showed him the receipt, he barely glanced at it. Said it proved nothing. Maybe Caitlin had a lock at home she'd forgotten the combination to. When I pointed out the timing, the pattern, the months of documentation, he cut me off. Told me that if I continued harassing Caitlin, I'd be the one facing disciplinary action. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. Diane Ostrander has built this company from nothing. Family is important to her. I'd suggest you remember that. That weekend, I got sick. Really sick. Fever, vomiting, muscle weakness so severe I could barely stand. My girlfriend Allison drove me to urgent care Sunday evening when my temperature hit 103.6. The doctor on duty, a tired-looking woman named Dr. Grace Kimura, ran basic tests, gave me IV fluids, sent me home with instructions to rest. But the symptoms didn't improve. By Wednesday, I'd lost 8 pounds. Couldn't keep food down. The brain fog had gotten worse. I'd forget what I was saying mid-sentence, lose track of time. Allison was terrified. She made an appointment with my primary care physician, Dr. Robert Chen. Wait, I need to remember the forbidden names. Let me call him Dr. Robert Finley. Dr. Robert Finley had been my doctor for 6 years, knew my medical history inside and out. When he saw me Thursday morning, his concern was immediate. Dr. Finley ordered comprehensive blood work, not just the basics, but a full toxicology panel. He asked questions that seemed strange at the time. Had I started any new medications? Been exposed to chemicals at work? Changed my diet recently? Had anyone had access to my food? That last question made something click. I told him about Caitlin, about the 6 months of theft, about how I'd been feeling progressively worse. His expression shifted. He told me the blood work would take 3 days to process, but he was putting in a rush order. He also referred me to Dr. Lisa Yamamoto, a toxicologist at Mercy General Hospital, for consultation. Said he wanted a specialist's perspective. The way he said it made my hands start shaking. I asked him directly if he thought someone was poisoning me. He was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Let's wait for the results." I went to work Friday in a daze. Sat at my desk, staring at code I couldn't process, jumping every time someone walked past. Caitlin came in late, as usual, looked refreshed and cheerful. Stopped by my desk, commented loudly about how tired I looked, asked if I was coming down with something. The concern in her voice sounded genuine, which somehow made it worse. Dev caught my eye across the partition, his expression dark. After she walked away, he rolled his chair over to my desk, spoke quietly. "Dude, I've been keeping track. Every day she steals your food, you look worse. Days you work from home or bring something she can't get to, you're fine. I'm not saying, I don't know what I'm saying, but maybe talk to a lawyer." The thought hadn't occurred to me. A lawyer. For what? Lunch theft? But Dev was right. The pattern was there. Dr. Finley called me at 2:37 p.m. that Friday. I was in a meeting, let it go to voicemail, called him back during my break. He asked me to come to his office immediately. Not Monday, not next week. Immediately. Said he'd already called Dr. Yamamoto and she was available to meet with me at 4 p.m. The fear that had been simmering for weeks exploded into full panic. I told Neil I had a medical emergency and left. Didn't care about his disapproval. Didn't care about the client presentation I was supposed to join. Drove to Dr. Finley's office with my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Allison met me there. I'd called her from the car, barely coherent. She held my hand in the waiting room, neither of us speaking, both of us knowing whatever came next was going to be bad. Dr. Finley didn't waste time with pleasantries. Pulled up my blood work on his computer screen, turned the monitor so we could see, started pointing out numbers that meant nothing to me, but his tone made their significance clear. Elevated liver enzymes, markers indicating systemic toxicity, traces of compounds that shouldn't be in my bloodstream. He used the word poisoning clinically, matter-of-factly, the way you might say infection or sprain. But then he explained what they'd found, low levels of prescription medications I'd never taken, specifically anxiolytics and sedatives. Not enough to cause immediate acute symptoms, but enough over time to cause exactly what I'd been experiencing. Cognitive impairment, nausea, weakness, exhaustion. Someone had been drugging me. Slowly. Deliberately. For months. I couldn't process it. Kept asking him to repeat himself, explain again. Allison was crying. Dr. Finley said the levels suggested chronic exposure, small doses administered regularly, probably through food or drink. He'd already contacted the police. Said a Detective James Granger from the Major Crimes Unit would be reaching out to me directly, and that I needed to see Dr. Yamamoto immediately to assess potential long-term damage. He printed out copies of the blood work, put them in an envelope, handed it to me with an expression of barely controlled anger. Told me to document everything I could remember, everyone who'd had access to my food, any security footage that might exist. Then he said something that made the room spin. "Whoever did this could have killed you. These combinations, even at low doses over time, can cause liver failure, respiratory depression. You're lucky you came in when you did. The meeting with Dr. Yamamoto was a blur. She was in her early 40s, spoke with the kind of calm authority that comes from years of dealing with the worst human nature has to offer. Ran more tests, drew more blood, asked detailed questions about my symptoms, my timeline, my work environment. When I told her about Caitlin, about the lunch theft, about HR's refusal to act, something shifted in her expression. She excused herself for a moment, came back with a notepad, asked me to write down everything, names, dates, specific incidents. Said this information would be important for the police investigation. Investigation. The word felt surreal. This was supposed to be about stolen lunches. Now it was poisoning, police, toxicology reports. I was living in a different reality than the one I'd woken up in that morning. Detective Granger called me at 7:15 that evening. Deep voice, professional, but not unkind. Asked if I could come to the station Saturday morning to make a formal statement. I agreed, hung up, and sat on my couch, staring at nothing while Allison made phone calls. To her parents, to my brother, to someone at a law firm her cousin had recommended. I felt disconnected from my body, like I was watching someone else's life implode. The thought that kept circling through my mind. This was about lunch. How does lunch turn into attempted murder? Because that's what Dr. Yamamoto had called it when I pressed her for clarity. Attempted murder, or at minimum aggravated assault. She couldn't know for certain without more evidence, but the pattern, the dosing, the duration, it suggested intent. Saturday morning at the police station felt like a nightmare you can't wake up from. Detective Granger was mid-50s, built like someone who'd played football in college and still hit the gym regularly. His partner, Detective Nina Foster, was younger, maybe 35, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. They recorded my statement, took notes, asked questions that made it clear they'd already spoken with Dr. Finley and Dr. Yamamoto. They wanted to know about workplace security, whether there were cameras, who had access to what areas. I told them Meridian had cameras in common areas but not at individual desks. Told them about the locked lunch container, the receipt from the locksmith store, the 6 months of documented complaints to HR. Nina asked if I still had the receipt photo. I showed her. She and Granger exchanged a look that told me they'd found their lead. They asked about Caitlin, her full name, her relationship to the CEO, her behavior patterns, whether she'd ever made threats. I explained the power dynamic, the way HR had protected her, the way management had implied I'd face consequences if I pushed the issue. Granger wrote everything down, his expression growing darker. He asked if I'd be willing to participate in a controlled sting operation, continuing to bring lunch as normal while they arranged surveillance. The idea made me physically ill. Nina saw my reaction, softened her tone. Said they understood this was traumatic, but they needed evidence that would hold up in court. Needed to catch her in the act, preferably with substances in her possession. She explained they were already working on a warrant for Caitlin's home and vehicle, but it would take a few days. The blood work gave them probable cause, but judges wanted more for search warrants, especially when the suspect had corporate connections. I spent the weekend in a fog of anxiety and disbelief. Allison barely left my side. She'd researched poisoning cases, read me statistics about how often it happens in workplace settings, how frequently perpetrators are people with authority or protection. The numbers should have been comforting, evidence I wasn't crazy, wasn't overreacting. Instead, they made everything worse. I was a statistic now, a victim. The word felt foreign, wrong. I'd always been the person who solved problems, who pushed through obstacles. Now I was the person who'd been systematically drugged for 6 months while his employer looked the other way. The rage, when it finally hit, was unlike anything I'd experienced before. Pure, clean, burning anger that made my hands shake and my jaw ache from clenching. Monday morning, I went back to work wearing a wire. Detective Foster had fitted me with it Sunday evening, a tiny device clipped inside my shirt, nearly invisible. She'd coached me on what to say, and more importantly, what not to say. Don't accuse, don't confront, just act normal. Let Caitlin incriminate herself through her own actions. They had an unmarked van in the parking garage with 2 officers monitoring the feed. Had coordinated with building security to review footage without alerting management. This was happening. This was real. I sat at my desk, pulled out my lunch, a sandwich Allison had made under police supervision, completely clean, no medications, and placed it in the fridge in a clear container with my name on it. Then I went back to my desk and waited. Caitlin arrived at 9:45, later than usual. She looked stressed, kept checking her phone, barely acknowledged anyone. I forced myself to focus on work, to not stare at the break room where the fridge was. At 10:30, she got up, walked toward the break room. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, could feel the wire against my skin. Nina had told me they had a camera angle on the fridge from the hallway. I didn't need to watch, but I couldn't help myself. Rolled my chair back slightly, adjusted my monitor angle so I could see through the glass wall that separated our team space from the break room. Watched her open the fridge, scan the contents, reach for my container. She pulled it out, looked around, then did something that made my breath catch. She pulled a small plastic bag from her pocket, opened my sandwich container, removed something from the bag, it looked like crushed pills, and sprinkled them onto my food. Carefully, methodically, like she'd done it 100 times before, because she had, for 6 months. I watched her reseal the container, shake it slightly to distribute whatever she'd added, then place it back in the fridge in the exact position she'd found it. The whole process took maybe 30 seconds. She walked out of the break room, past my desk, smiled at me. "Morning. How are you feeling today?" Her voice was cheerful, concerned. I managed to say, "Better, thanks," through a throat that felt like it was closing. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her desk. Detective Foster called me 2 minutes later, told me to take a long lunch break, leave the building, meet them at a coffee shop 3 blocks away. I grabbed my jacket and left, didn't tell anyone where I was going. The coffee shop was nearly empty. Nina and Granger were in a back corner booth. The expression on Nina's face told me they'd seen everything. "We've got her," Granger said without preamble. Pulled out a tablet, showed me the footage. Crystal clear video of Caitlin tampering with my food, clear shot of the bag she'd pulled from her pocket. Nina said they'd already called for backup, had units positioned near the building. They were going to arrest her within the hour, execute the search warrants simultaneously. They asked if I wanted to be there. I said no. Couldn't stomach the thought of seeing her face when they put the handcuffs on. Part of me wanted that vindication, but a larger part just wanted it over. They arrested Caitlin Ostrander at 11:53 a.m. in the Meridian Technologies parking lot as she was leaving for lunch. 6 officers, 3 vehicles, executed with a precision that suggested they weren't taking any chances with the CEO's niece trying to run or destroy evidence. The search of her car turned up a bottle of alprazolam, not prescribed to her, and a bottle of zolpidem, also not prescribed. The search of her apartment, executed simultaneously, found a notebook, a detailed handwritten log of dates, times, and substances. 6 months of entries, 6 months of her documenting, in her own handwriting, what she was putting in my food and when. The prosecutors would later call it the poisoner's diary. It was the kind of evidence that turns a shaky, circumstantial case into a prosecutor's dream. The fallout was immediate and comprehensive. Within 2 hours of Caitlin's arrest, Diane Ostrander issued a company-wide email placing her niece on indefinite administrative leave pending investigation. Within 4 hours, she'd hired a crisis management firm. Within 6 hours, reporters had the story. Someone leaked it, probably from inside the police department, and suddenly, Meridian Technologies was the lead story on every local news outlet. CEO's niece arrested for allegedly poisoning coworker. HR ignored months of complaints. Victim suffered documented medical harm. The optics were catastrophic. I turned off my phone after the 5th reporter called. Allison fielded the rest, screening everything, protecting me from the feeding frenzy my life had become. The investigation expanded rapidly. Detectives interviewed everyone on my team, reviewed 6 months of security footage, pulled my HR complaint file, which Rita Beaumont had documented extensively, which ironically now proved the company had known there was a problem and done nothing. They interviewed Neil, Jeffrey, Rita herself. The story they pieced together was damning. Caitlin had been hired specifically to work on my team because I was lead developer on a project worth $40 million to the company. Diane Ostrander wanted family oversight on major initiatives, but Caitlin had no technical skills, couldn't contribute meaningfully, felt inadequate and humiliated. According to her roommate, whom police interviewed, Caitlin had complained constantly about some arrogant developer who made her feel stupid just by being competent. What made the investigation particularly complex was the sheer volume of evidence they uncovered once they started looking. Detective Granger brought in a digital forensics specialist, a former FBI analyst named Trevor Beauchamp, who'd spent 12 years in the Bureau's cybercrimes division. Trevor pulled data from Caitlin's work computer that she'd thought was deleted, emails to her aunt complaining about me, searches for pharmaceutical information, even drafts of resignation letters she'd apparently planned to submit after I'd been forced out due to incompetence. One email to Diane, dated 3 months into the poisoning, read, "Don't worry, the problem is solving itself. He'll be gone soon, and I can finally prove I belong here." Diane had responded, "Good, keep me updated." That single exchange would later become Exhibit A in proving corporate knowledge and complicity. Trevor also found something else. Caitlin had been documenting my decline in a separate file hidden in her personal cloud storage. Photos of me taken surreptitiously at my desk, dated and annotated with observations about my appearance and behavior. "Looking exhausted today?" one caption read. "Struggled through stand-up meeting, forgot his talking points twice," said another. It was like she'd been running a clinical trial, tracking her experiment's progress. The prosecutors would later use these photos in trial to show the jury the physical deterioration over 6 months. The first photo showed me healthy, focused, engaged. The last showed a hollow-eyed stranger who'd lost 20 pounds and looked a decade older. The jury sat in stunned silence when Monica displayed them side by side on the courtroom screens. The forensic analysis of the substances found in Caitlin's possession revealed another disturbing layer. The alprazolam and zolpidem she'd been using weren't from a single source. She'd been obtaining them through multiple channels, some from her mother's prescription bottles, some purchased through online pharmacies using fake credentials, some allegedly obtained from a former college friend who worked at a pharmacy and was later arrested as an accessory. Each source gave her small quantities, nothing that would trigger red flags individually, but combined over months, She'd accumulated enough to dose someone daily for over a year. Dr. Yamamoto testified that the careful sourcing suggested Caitlin understood she needed to avoid detection, which contradicted the defense's later claims that she didn't understand what she was doing. The poisoning, the investigators theorized, had started as retaliation, but evolved into something more calculated. If she could make me sick enough, unreliable enough, maybe I'd be removed from the project and she could take credit for its completion. The timeline supported this theory. My symptoms had worsened significantly in month 5, right as the project was entering its critical phase. The drugs she'd been using, anxiolytics and sedatives, were specifically chosen to impair cognitive function while being difficult to detect without specific toxicology screening. She'd done research. Her browser history, recovered from her laptop during the search, showed queries about undetectable poisons, drugs that cause dementia-like symptoms, how long substances stay in the bloodstream. She'd planned this. The criminal charges came fast: aggravated assault with intent to cause serious bodily injury, administering poison with intent to injure, computer tampering. She'd apparently also installed spyware on my work computer during one of her desk raids, identity theft. She'd stolen my security credentials to access project files, and half a dozen other counts. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Monica Reeves, 23 years with the DA's office and a reputation for taking down entitled defendants, personally took the case. She called me 3 days after Caitlin's arrest, asked if I'd be willing to testify. I said yes immediately. Monica said she'd never seen a case with such clear-cut evidence of premeditation and sustained malice. Said the diary alone would probably be enough to convict, but she wanted to build an overwhelming case. Wanted to make sure Caitlin Ostrander spent real time in prison. Meridian Technologies tried to bury it. Diane Ostrander's initial statement expressed shock and concern for my well-being, but the company's actions told a different story. They lawyered up hard, hired Kellerman and Hodge, the most aggressive corporate defense firm in the state. Their strategy was clear: minimize company liability, frame this as a rogue employee acting alone, emphasize that HR had followed proper procedures. Except HR hadn't followed proper procedures. Rita Beaumont had documented my complaints, but taken no meaningful action. Neil had actively discouraged me from pursuing the issue. Jeffrey had threatened me with disciplinary action for reporting theft. The paper trail was damning. I hired a lawyer. Actually, Allison's cousin hired one for me. Stephanie Blackwood, employment litigation specialist with 43 civil rights cases under her belt and a track record of destroying corporations that enabled workplace abuse. She took one look at my documentation, the medical records, the police reports, and smiled. Not a happy smile. A predatory smile. She filed a civil suit against Meridian Technologies, Diane Ostrander personally, Rita Beaumont, Neil Thornton, and Jeffrey Lansing 6 days after Caitlin's arrest. Failure to provide a safe work environment, negligent retention, intentional infliction of emotional distress, conspiracy to commit assault. Asked for $8 million in damages. The number seemed insane to me. Stephanie said it was conservative. Said my medical bills alone would hit 6 figures by the time we accounted for long-term monitoring, and that didn't touch the psychological damage, lost wages, or punitive damages. Said companies like Meridian only learned when you hit them hard enough to scar. The media coverage intensified. National outlets picked up the story. It had everything they loved: corporate corruption, family privilege, attempted murder, whistleblower retaliation. I became the lunch poisoning victim, which felt reductive, but wasn't inaccurate. Reporters camped outside my apartment. I stopped going to work. Stephanie advised medical leave, and Dr. Yamamoto provided documentation supporting indefinite disability. My liver function was compromised. The cognitive impairment would take months to fully resolve, if it ever did completely. I was on a half-dozen medications to help my body process and eliminate the accumulated toxins. Some days were better than others. Some days I could barely get out of bed. Allison essentially moved in, took over everything I couldn't handle, which some days was nearly everything. The psychological impact was worse than the physical. Hypervigilance. Paranoia about food. Nightmares where I couldn't move, couldn't speak, while Caitlin stood over me smiling. The preliminary hearing was in month 7, counting from the first lunch theft. I testified via video link. Monica's request said she didn't want to stress me unnecessarily before trial. Watched Caitlin on the screen, sitting next to her attorney, wearing a conservative dress and minimal makeup, looking nothing like the smirking office bully who'd stolen my food and my health. She cried during my testimony. Her lawyer objected constantly, tried to paint me as a disgruntled employee with a grudge, someone who'd manufactured evidence to harm an innocent young woman. But the judge, Honorable David Kowalski, presiding over criminal court for 19 years, wasn't buying it. He denied bail, said Caitlin represented a clear danger to others, especially given the premeditation shown in her diary. She was remanded to county jail pending trial. Her mother, Diane Ostrander's sister, collapsed in the courtroom. The news cameras caught it. It was the lead story that night. Diane Ostrander resigned as CEO in month 8. The board pressured her, according to sources who leaked to the press. Her position was untenable or... Her niece was facing 15 to 30 years in prison for poisoning an employee, and it had happened under her watch, at her company, with multiple opportunities for intervention ignored. Her resignation statement was brief, carefully worded by lawyers, admitted nothing. The board installed an interim CEO, brought in an external firm to investigate the company's HR practices and culture. That investigation found systematic problems, complaints dismissed, employees intimidated, retaliation against whistleblowers. Rita Beaumont was fired. Neil Thornton was fired. Jeffrey Lansing was fired. The cleanup was brutal and public. Meridian stock dropped 18% in 2 weeks. Clients started walking. The $40 million project I'd been leading was put on indefinite hold. The company I'd given 4 years of my life to was imploding, and I felt nothing. Maybe I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I just felt tired. The civil case moved faster than the criminal one. Stephanie filed motions, demanded depositions, pulled every document she could legally access. Meridian's lawyers fought back hard, but they were hamstrung by the criminal evidence. Everything that had come out in Caitlin's case made their defense nearly impossible. How do you argue the company provided a safe workplace when their documentation proved they'd ignored months of complaints about the person who ended up poisoning someone? How do you claim the HR followed procedures when their procedures allowed a CEO's niece to commit felonies with impunity? They couldn't. 3 months after I filed suit, Meridian Technologies offered to settle. $8.2 million. Stephanie said we should push for more. I said take it. I didn't want to fight anymore. Didn't want to relive this in depositions and trials. Just wanted it over. But before the settlement was finalized, Stephanie insisted on deposing the key players. She wanted their testimony on record, wanted them to admit under oath what they'd done and failed to do. Rita Beaumont's deposition lasted 7 hours. I watched via video feed from Stephanie's office, saw Rita's carefully maintained composure crack as Stephanie walked her through every complaint I'd filed, every email I'd sent, every documented incident. Rita kept insisting she'd followed protocol, but Stephanie produced the company's own HR manual, highlighted the sections about employee safety and mandatory investigation procedures. Rita had violated her own policies repeatedly. When Stephanie asked why she hadn't escalated to legal or conducted a proper investigation after my second complaint, Rita went silent for 43 seconds. The court reporter noted the pause. Finally, she said, "I was told family matters required special discretion." Stephanie asked who told her that. Rita looked directly at the camera and said, "Diane Ostrander." Neil Thornton's deposition was worse. He showed up defensive, kept trying to reframe his actions as reasonable management decisions. Stephanie destroyed him methodically, played audio from a meeting where he'd told me to drop the issue, where he'd threatened my career for pushing back. Neil claimed he didn't remember saying that. Stephanie produced 6 witnesses who'd overheard the conversation, including Dev, who'd been sitting in the next cubicle. Then Stephanie asked about the bonus comment, the one where Neil had mentioned Diane personally approving his compensation. Asked if he'd felt pressured to protect Caitlin to maintain his own financial standing. Neil's lawyer objected, but the question hung there. Neil finally admitted he'd been aware of certain sensitivities regarding Caitlin's position. Stephanie asked him to define sensitivities. He couldn't, not without admitting he'd protected her because of who her aunt was. Jeffrey Lansing's deposition revealed the extent of the corporate rot. Jeffrey had been at Meridian for 14 years, climbed to operations director, prided himself on running a tight ship. Stephanie asked him about our conversation where he'd told me to let it go, where he'd threatened me with disciplinary action. Jeffrey initially denied it happened. Stephanie produced my contemporaneous notes, time-stamped, along with building security footage showing me entering his office at the exact time I'd documented. Then she asked the question that broke him. "Did you consider that by silencing Mr. Narrator, you were enabling someone to continue poisoning him?" Jeffrey's face went white. He stammered something about not knowing it was poisoning, just thought it was a lunch dispute. Stephanie leaned in. "But you knew it was something serious enough that he'd filed multiple complaints, serious enough that he was documenting everything, serious enough that you felt the need to threaten his job. What did you think would happen if you forced him to stay silent?" Jeffrey had no answer. The criminal trial began in month 11. I testified in person this time. Had to. Monica said jury needed to see me, needed to see what prolonged poisoning does to someone. I'd lost 23 pounds. My hands shook when I held things. My memory was still compromised. I needed notes to remember specific dates, details. Dr. Yamamoto testified about the medical evidence, explained the toxicology in terms the jury could understand. Dr. Finley testified about my condition when I'd first come to him, how the symptoms had fit a pattern he'd only seen once before in 30 years of practice. Detective Granger testified about the investigation, walked the jury through the evidence step by step. Nina testified about the surveillance, showed the video of Caitlin tampering with my food. The jury watched in silence. Some looked sick. One woman was crying. Caitlin's defense was predictable. Mental health crisis, never intended real harm, didn't understand the potential severity of her actions. Her lawyer brought in a psychiatrist who testified about adjustment disorder and impulsive behavior. Tried to paint her as a troubled young woman overwhelmed by corporate pressure, acting out in unhealthy ways, but not malicious. Monica destroyed that narrative on cross-examination. Brought up the diary, the research into undetectable poisons, the 6 months of sustained behavior. Asked the psychiatrist if adjustment disorder typically involved elaborate documentation of criminal acts. The psychiatrist stammered, admitted it didn't fit the profile. Monica then brought up Caitlin's browser history, searches like how to poison someone without getting caught, and symptoms of slow poisoning. The jury's expressions hardened. Whatever sympathy Caitlin's appearance and tears had generated evaporated. The verdict came after 4 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all counts. Caitlin stared straight ahead, expression blank, as the judge read each one. Guilty of aggravated assault with intent to cause serious bodily injury. Guilty of administering poison with intent to injure. Guilty of computer tampering. Guilty of identity theft. 7 felonies total. Her mother sobbed in the gallery. Diane Ostrander, who'd attended every day of the trial, sat stone-faced. The judge scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later. Monica squeezed my shoulder as we left the courtroom, said it was one of the most clear-cut convictions she'd ever won. I nodded, numb. It should have felt like victory. It just felt hollow. Sentencing day, Judge Kowalski didn't mince words, called Caitlin's actions calculated, cruel, and enabled by a corporate culture that valued power over people. Noted that I'd suffered lasting physical and psychological harm. Noted that she'd shown no genuine remorse. Her tears in court were for herself, not for what she'd done to me. Sentenced her to 23 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for 15. The courtroom erupted. Caitlin's lawyer immediately filed notice of appeal. Her mother collapsed again. Apparently that was her thing. Diane Ostrander walked out without comment. Monica turned to me, asked how I was feeling. I said I didn't know. She said that was fair. Said healing wasn't linear, wasn't simple. Said I should be proud I'd survived. I wasn't sure proud was the word I'd use. Relieved, maybe. Broken, definitely. A year and 3 months after the first lunch theft, I was living in a different city, working for a different company remotely, seeing a therapist twice a week, and still taking medication for the lingering effects of chronic poisoning. My relationship with Allison had survived, though barely. Trauma like this breaks some couples, and we'd come close. She'd started seeing her own therapist to deal with secondary trauma from supporting me through the worst of it. We were rebuilding. Slowly. Some days were good. Some days I couldn't eat lunch without panic attacks. I'd never set foot in Meridian Technologies again. Collected my personal items through a lawyer, never spoke to anyone from that office. Dev reached out once, sent a long email apologizing for not doing more, for not pushing harder when he'd first noticed the pattern. I wrote back, told him it wasn't his fault. Meant it, mostly. The therapy was brutal in ways I hadn't anticipated. My therapist, Dr. Angela Russo, specialized in trauma recovery and had worked with poisoning victims before. Apparently it's more common than most people realize. She explained that what I was experiencing wasn't just PTSD from a single traumatic event, but complex trauma from sustained, intentional harm combined with institutional betrayal. The fact that my employer had protected my abuser, that the people who should have helped me had threatened me instead, created a specific kind of psychological damage. Dr. Russo said trust issues were normal, hypervigilance was expected, and the food-related panic attacks might take years to fully resolve. She taught me grounding techniques, helped me work through the rage that would hit me at random moments, sat with me while I processed the reality that someone had tried to kill me over a work project. The physical recovery was equally challenging. Dr. Yamamoto referred me to a hepatologist, Dr. Kenneth O'Hara, who specialized in drug-induced liver damage. The prolonged exposure to benzodiazepines and sedatives had compromised my liver function in ways that would require monitoring for the rest of my life. Dr. O'Hara put me on a strict regimenal monthly blood work, dietary restrictions, no alcohol, careful management of any medications. He explained that while my liver would likely recover most of its function, I'd always be at higher risk for complications, that I'd essentially lost years of health, cellular damage that couldn't be completely undone. Some mornings I'd wake up and the unfairness of it would hit me fresh, that my body was permanently changed because someone didn't like that I was good at my job. The money from the settlement sat in an account I barely touched. Felt tainted somehow, like accepting blood money. Stephanie said that was normal, said most of her clients struggled with compensation for suffering. Said eventually I'd figure out what to do with it, maybe use it for something meaningful. I'd thought about starting a nonprofit for workplace abuse victims, people whose complaints get ignored because their abusers have power and connections. Hadn't committed yet. Wasn't sure I was strong enough to relive this over and over by helping others through it. Maybe someday. Maybe when the nightmares stopped. When I could eat lunch without checking for powder, without analyzing every texture and taste, without wondering if someone was slowly killing me again. Allison and I had conversations about the money that felt surreal. $8.2 million should have been life-changing in a positive way, but it just felt like a number attached to suffering. She suggested we use some of it to fund research into workplace toxin exposure or to create a scholarship for occupational health and safety studies. Her practical approach helped sometimes, turned the abstract horror into something potentially productive. We donated $500,000 to a victims' rights organization, another $200,000 to a program that provided free legal services to workers facing retaliation. Small steps toward feeling like the money meant something beyond my pain. Dr. Russo said this was part of processing, finding meaning in meaninglessness, creating purpose from trauma. I wasn't sure I'd ever fully succeed at that, but I was trying. Caitlin Ostrander is currently in Bedford Hills Correctional Facility serving her sentence. She'll be eligible for parole in 14 years. I'll be 46. She'll be 40. Her attorney's appeal was denied. Diane Ostrander hasn't worked since resigning. Apparently being the CEO who enabled her niece to poison an employee isn't great for career prospects. Meridian Technologies downsized by 30%, lost most of their major clients, and is rumored to be filing for bankruptcy. The $40 million project I spent years building was never completed. Rita, Neil, and Jeffrey all found new jobs eventually. Corporate America is remarkably forgiving to its own, though I hear they're not thriving. The Whisper Network made sure everyone knew what they'd done. Some justice is formal, some is just permanent reputation damage. I still can't believe it sometimes, that my life exploded over stolen lunches, that someone hated me enough to slowly poison me for months, that a corporation protected her until they couldn't anymore, that I almost died because I was good at my job, and that threatened someone with family money and no consequences. The randomness of it makes it worse somehow. I didn't do anything to provoke this. I just existed in her space, reminded her of her inadequacy by being competent, and for that, she tried to destroy me. Nearly succeeded too. If not for Dr. Finley's instincts, if not for Detective Granger and Nina's thoroughness, if not for Monica's determination to prosecute fully, I might have just kept getting sicker. Might have lost my job, my health, my life, all because someone felt entitled to my food, to my space, to my destruction. The story went viral eventually. Not just local news, but national coverage. Think pieces about nepotism and workplace safety, true crime podcasts that dissected every detail. I declined every interview request. Let Monica and Stephanie handle press. Didn't want to be the face of workplace poisoning. Didn't want my trauma packaged as entertainment. But I understand why it resonated. Because everyone who's ever worked in an office has dealt with small injustices. Stolen food, credit theft, petty power plays. Most of the time, it doesn't escalate. Most of the time, HR actually does their job. Most of the time, the CEO's niece doesn't have a diary documenting her months-long poisoning campaign. But sometimes it does escalate. And when it does, you're left wondering how something so small became so catastrophic. How protecting someone's feelings became more important than protecting someone's life. 3 years later, I'm okay. Not fixed, not the same person I was before, but okay. I've learned to eat lunch without fear most days. Learned to trust my instincts when something feels wrong. Learned that documentation matters, that speaking up matters, even when no one listens at first. I've also learned that justice is messy and incomplete, and doesn't heal you the way you think it will. Caitlin going to prison didn't give me my health back. The settlement didn't erase the trauma. Monica's perfect prosecution didn't stop the nightmares. But it mattered anyway, because at least everyone knows what she did. At least other companies had to answer questions about their HR practices. At least one fewer person is out there slowly poisoning their coworkers because they feel inadequate. At least I survived. Some days, that has to be enough. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.